Welcome, everyone. I'm Kyle MacDonald, a project leader in Boston Consulting's CEO advisory practice, who in a prior life spent 10 years in the fascinating world of family offices. But today, I'm your host on Simple's webinar on family office service design. To those of you joining for the first time, Simple powers the next generation of family offices through the end-to-end products and services that make family offices journeys straightforward. To access accessible insights and solutions from today's webinar, you can access our Family Office Service Design Report by heading over to the website, at ansimple.co. So that's ansimple.co, or by scanning the QR code on screen. Joining me today on the panel is India Woolridge. So India founded Catalyst, where she helps family offices create cohesive, purpose-driven wealth stories that build lasting legacies. With 20 years of experience, she has advised over 200 clients globally, including major brands like Microsoft and MasterCard. Her expertise in brand strategy and innovation has been recognized by prominent publications and platforms like the Wall Street Journal and South by Southwest. Next up, we have got Nicholas Arroyo. Nicholas is a partner and head of strategic foresight at ManyOne, a global strategy design consultancy with over 16 years in creative industries and a background in architecture, visual arts, and change leadership. Nicholas inspires organizations to design better futures by integrating business, design, culture, and strategy. He was a founding partner at Bespoke Copenhagen, focusing on futures design across various industries and regions. Incredibly happy to have both of you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, it's great to be here.
Awesome. We are looking forward to having quite a engaging conversation around service design. But before we do that, I'll just give those of you tuning in to an idea of the agenda that we'll be following, and then we'll get started and jump straight in. So we're going to be covering 5 sections. The first is looking at core service design in family offices. The second, we'll be looking at service design and future trends. Next, after that, we'll be looking at insourcing and outsourcing in family offices. We'll then be looking at the challenges and strategic insights of service design. And then we'll look a little bit at where sort of the future heads for our panel today. So really the outcome of the session today is we're looking to sort of outline how the next generation of family offices are leveraging service design to future-proof themselves. So let's kick off. So thinking a little bit about what the core services are that you might find in a traditional family office. So I might sort of outline some of those for you. So on one side, we have the investment side of a typical family office. So this might be looking at how we preserve wealth, how we grow wealth, and ultimately how we think about the division and sort of governance of that wealth. There then obviously is the family governance side. So again, this looks at the service provision of how families are supported throughout generations. You then might look at the more sort of legal side of things within a family. So again, this feeds into that family governance piece, often looking at the exec board, etc., trusts, and all of the above. And then finally, there's more of the lifestyle section. So here you might actually be looking at quite a sizable piece of the family. How do you support families in the next generation to be set up for success? These are, high-performing organizations that need a high level of high-touch support. And with that, obviously, comes a lot of servicing and services. So with that, I might sort of pose the question to our panel. What additional services are you beginning to see the next generation of family offices have an appetite to engage with? And Nicholas, I might sort of point that question in your direction.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think if there's anything that is very alive, I would say, in the landscape is the idea of contributing to something beyond profit. Common good or something that has a larger impact for larger amounts of people in society and the planet as well. So And of course, how do you do that in a sustainable way that is also can be lasting over time? I think that's definitely an area where companies and family offices are also looking into, how do you turn this space of need that we have in society, in the world, for contributing for the greater good, also into a business opportunity, into an opportunity for developing things and services that maybe don't exist yet, and that also can contribute beyond for the next generations.
Very much so. So, I mean, I know that, much of what we see at Simple, there's a lot of families, particularly in Europe and the US, who are focused quite heavily on this legacy. And obviously with legacy comes impact. And with impact, we begin to kind of see, chief impact officers working alongside the investment teams. And obviously there's the other side of that, which is topics that we've covered in some of the other family office webinars. For those of you who've joined in to those ones, topics such as cybersecurity, so how do you begin to think a little bit more about the security, particularly in a more volatile world? And obviously, there's the physical security side. And then beyond that, there's sort of how do you manage data? So increasingly, family offices are becoming more and more data centric and more data driven. And with that, that's sort of a new space for them to play and to think about how they get to that certain level of data maturity. So yeah, those are just some of the services we're beginning to sort of see emerge in the next generation of family offices. Well, perhaps we'll start off with what is service design? And again, Nicholas, I might point to you on this question, and then India, I have another question for you to follow up on.
Yeah, I guess there's many ways of defining that field. But in general, is the idea of creating experiences, services for that matter, with intent, understanding what are the contexts where these experiences could take place, and what would be the dynamics that will kind of play a role into in these experiences, and also what will be the aftermath of these experiences, how these experiences will extend, will they continue, how will they be sustainable over time, right? So it's a broad range of exercises, you could say, on thinking about a product or an offer or an experience, not just as isolated products, you could say, but actually as an experience that takes place in a larger context, in an environment, in a landscape that has certain drivers and factors that influence how the dynamics play in that space. And also it will have an impact on users, on people that maybe are not users as well in the broader society, and having this more systemic approach to looking into solutions that is not just as isolated products, isolated solutions, but actually something that's part of a larger landscape, right?
Very much so. Oh, go ahead, India.
No, I was going to add to that because I love that description. But I think what I'd add to that, especially when kind of drilling down into the element of design thinking, is ultimately a really fancy term for creating solutions with a deeply human lens. And that means we're being deeply empathetic, we're being collaborative, we're thinking about solutions that are tested and piloted. It allows for multiple different perspectives, as Nicholas was saying about. But ultimately what that drives is more effective outcomes. And it's a guiding principle that I talk about at Catalyst within my business is, by relentlessly focusing on the value that you provide to your clients, your customers, you're driving value for your business. And design thinking and service design is such a powerful tool in enabling that, because it allows everybody to contribute. It allows everyone to feel like they've got skin in the game. But ultimately what you're doing is kind of de-risking implementing that change, because you're ensuring that what you're going to build and what you're going to create, people are buying into, but also that it allows for a kind of iterative, kind of slower adoption of change that makes everyone feel comfortable with it as well. And I think for me, the main benefit of it all is when you're taking this human-centric approach, the strength and the effectiveness of solution is tenfold, and it really allows for successful adoption of kind of the change in the organization that you're trying to build.
Exactly. I think, 2 points both of you raised. One, Nicholas, around this idea of designing experience, and India to you, obviously bringing the human into the center of that experience. So thinking, and obviously, as we begin to think a little bit more beyond the human in the center of that experience, obviously their environment, the impact, the planet, and the system that ultimately serves. But to bring it back to, thinking through perhaps more classical forms of design and strategy, we think about designing products, we think about designing buildings, we think about developing strategies. Ultimately, service design is the process of beginning to think a little bit about, how do we design the experience that a human has of an interaction with something before, during, and after, and ultimately, how does that then drive the outcomes that would be desirable to sort of drive the type of impact that they'd like to see. So thinking a little bit more about that, how are you beginning to see the likes of service design and design thinking being adopted in adjacent industries like financial services and hospitality, India?
I think, when we're thinking about a kind of how it's starting to be adopted, you're starting to see people understanding that having this human-centric perspective is the way in which you're going to basically enable change far more successfully. And I'm sure a lot of this is happening in family offices or adjacent industries, but service design really allows for a more structured approach. And when you start to professionalize that approach and everybody's doing it consistently, that's where you start to see real efficiencies rise. And I've seen it time and time again, no matter what size the organization, some of the largest corporations through to some of the tiniest startups, as soon as silos and different ways of working occur, you start to see a lag in the operations, a lag in the efficiencies. And for me, I think when we're starting to think about how it's been, I'd say, adopted in many industries, like many organizations, solutions are kind of developed in piecemeal fashion over time. What service design and design thinking allows for is you to take a step back, kind of appraise the current needs of an organization and build solutions that are fit for that moment in time and for the future. And I think that's happening, whether it's financial solutions, I think it's happening in family offices. And the outcome really is like in uniting these perspectives and goals across different disciplines or in family offices across different generations, you're able to co-create these kind of new innovative solutions, which, as we've been outlining, kind of really then ensures a successful outcome.
Yeah. Nicholas, are you seeing sort of similar demands happening from some of your clients across the sectors that are, perhaps similar to family offices? So things like FI or hospitality?
Yeah, absolutely. I think something that's very alive now is this idea of democratizing some of these processes, like India was mentioning, putting the human at the center, and not just the user, but actually the company, the employees, people working in a company want to be part of something bigger, right? When you look into what people value the most in a job, salary is not number one, it's number fourth or number fifth in the list, right? But the most important thing for most people is to feel that you are, that you have a job that's meaningful, that you can be part of shaping something. And what design thinking, service design, all of these kind of processes, what they do is that, of course, they set up some sort of blueprint that makes it more accessible for people that maybe is not, as you could say, naturally creative in a way in the traditional sense, and so that they can be part of processes like this in terms of understanding emerging needs, customer needs, how do you design experiences and things like that. It makes it more accessible, it makes it easier for them to be part of, right, and feel that they're actually contributing on the creation of a new experience or a new solution. So that element of democratizing some of these processes that maybe a couple of decades ago was only reserved for the creative types or the people that work more with the strategy part. Suddenly, what I can see a lot now is like everybody wants to take part of that, and companies want people to take part on these processes because they have a lot of talent, they have a lot of smart people working inside this organization. How do we use that asset, that knowledge asset that lies within most organizations?
Yeah, I'd love to add to that because I think it's a really powerful point, actually. I think people don't get exposed to other parts of their organization, even in small teams. And some of the feedback I've had as a part of doing this with my clients is, I had no idea my colleague was thinking this way. I had no idea about that part of the organization. And I think one of the best feedbacks I got was from a CEO who said, look, I knew we'd get something good out of this, but I had no idea how aligned we would be as a team, how energized we'd feel, and how together we'd feel moving forward as a part of this. And I think service design and design thinking is such a powerful tool in doing that. And it can't be underestimated, the impact that can have in an organization when you get people rallying around and galvanized in that way.
Right.
Yeah. I wanted to add that element of culture, that at the end of the day is about changing culture. And of course, you can have tons of different methods and frameworks and how you do this, but at the end of the day, it's about the culture and creating a culture of collaboration, of curiosity, of courage. That's the difficult part, right? Because frameworks we can find a lot, but then creating that right culture, like you were saying, India, so that people can be part of it. Is essential.
Yeah, I mean, to sort of create some parallels in other industries. So if we think of the journey that banking has been on, all of us have had the experience of working with, engaging with apps back in the day when you were just wanting to transfer money across borders, and it would take you, how many steps to kind of get the visibility of where your funds were going, to get an update, to understand what that looked like. So from a banking perspective, we've come a long way to be able to, just use phrases like, can you Venmo me? Can you Revolut me? Can you Monzo me if you're sort of here in the UK, to really revolutionize the experience we have with how we're able to manage things like our finances. And much like sort of thinking, beyond the digital, I've done quite a bit of work sort of with airlines and within hospitality as well, and thinking through what does that experience feel like for the passenger, and what does that journey feel like in terms of thinking about booking, actually booking the process, using the app, having that experience of engaging with an airline, that sort of anticipation, and then all the way through to, what does that journey feel like? I have no leg room. I'm sort of having to, my flight's being canceled. I'm having to run to the gate because the gate's chained. Now, often things, perhaps family offices have a slightly different lens on, but much of that same level of sort of lack of empathy is what had created these poor services that for many times had been quite unconsciously stitched together to create these much broader end-to-end experiences, which obviously cost families a significant amount of money in terms of operating costs, and B, sort of really drives a lot of frustration in terms of, we are trying to create a high-performing sports team, if you will, to drive the type of impact they'd like to see in the world, preserve their sort of financial well-being, and ultimately drive towards sort of preserving and growing their wealth. And how can we make sure that the services that we sort of implement ultimately have that capability? So it's sort of consciously stitching those services together, auditing them, making sure you sort of understand what they can and should be, and then really thinking about, okay, which parts of those from a prioritized lens should I begin to think about innovating on, and how do I run sort of experiences with that? So that probably takes us quite nicely into our next piece, which is thinking a little bit through about, what is the typical process and toolkit of service designers and design thinkers. So perhaps, India, what are some of the things that you really find most useful when it comes to engaging in the service design and design thinking process?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say not to try and oversimplify a very, very big, broad topic, but I think broadly speaking, there are kind of four main phases of service design, no matter whether it's coming from a big white label consultancy or, more boutique practices. And just to summarize the four phases, I think are probably most common, but let's discuss. You've got firstly that insights immersion, and that kind of real empathy driven piece, and understanding what's making people tick, how we can optimize. I mean, Carl, you hit upon it multiple times. What friction can we remove is a really important piece of this. And really getting under the skin of how do we identify the human needs. And that can be both quantitatively. I'm a huge fan of anonymous surveys, getting really under the skin of it and letting people have their full gamut of getting the kind of catharsis and honesty out. We can't design services unless we know really what's going on. Or even though from a qualitative level, really understanding just kind of one-on-one interviews. So getting that kind of really tight, deep insights immersion is really critical. I always say your outputs are only ever going to be as good as your inputs. So don't skip on this. I think people try and fast track this. Really immerse and really understand is important. Next up, the second phase is ideation. And as it relates to the work that I do, and I really think with the design thinking, co-creation is the name of the game here. Really be deeply skeptical if anyone ever comes to you and says, this is it, this is the answer. No, really, we want to be testing out different scenarios, pressure testing ideas, getting their sleeves rolled up. It's really important that this is part of the process because then people feel involved, to Nicholas's point earlier. And when people feel involved, when people feel they've contributed, they're invested in the outcome. They've got skin in the game. If they've got skin in the game, the solution is more likely to be adopted, which is much more likely to be successful. So there's kind of like tricks of the trade we really harness here to ensure that we're going to pull this throughout. And next up, we kind of move on to the kind of the output phase of this. And that's the kind of thirdly, we're thinking about how we're implementing it. And I'll let kind of Nicholas speak more to this because I know he's kind of expert around prototyping, but really using kind of sort of mapping your services, mapping that client experience, mapping the employee experience to ensure it's as user-friendly as possible and thinking about where you can optimize every single touch point and or remove friction. I think removing friction is one of the most key parts of this and thinking about how you can leverage existing behaviors or existing processes, again, to really help embed these kind of service designs is really key. And then the last phase, fourth, is kind of iterating and measuring. So really thinking about how this isn't a one and done process. I like to do quarterly reviews with my clients to ensure that we're really optimizing it, we're checking we're on track, we're tweaking if necessary, and ensuring that this is a long-term success story, not kind of something fun to engage with for a short amount of time. So I guess to recap, kind of insights immersion, number one, second, ideation, co-creation, third, thinking about implementation and kind of the prototyping and piloting, and fourth, iterating and measuring. That's the kind of a very top line approach for a deep subject, but love to hear your builds on that.
Definitely. Nicholas, over to you. What are some of the things that you find particularly useful when engaging with the service design practice?
Yeah, I think India made a really good recap on the, generally speaking, I think those are the kind of the bigger steps. Of course, then within each of those main areas, I guess there's a large variety of approaches depending on what kind of project you have at hand or what kind of challenge you want to solve, right? But I would put emphasis also a little bit on the area that I work a lot with, which is the strategic foresight and insights and future insights part, especially at the beginning on that, on that first phase of, gaining insight on a topic, which I think is extremely important to have a good knowledge foundation before you embark on a creative journey, you could say like that, right? So what I observe a lot is, if you think of somebody, a creative person, right? A creative person has a very large amount of knowledge. We talked about that creativity is the ability to connect the dots, right? But we also need to have dots to connect. So how do we get those dots? And creative people, is naturally curious. They read a lot, they travel, they talk to people, they're curious about things that might seem a little bit distant from each other, right? And I think the part that I found really interesting is how do we bring that mindset into organizations? How do we make organizations that, for example, a finance organization, a bank, how do we make them curious about things that are beyond finance? They should be curious about culture and art and energy and transportation and things that maybe seem a little bit far away from their domain, but they might have an effect on their industry eventually, right? Especially now where a lot of industries are merging. Every companies, a technology company now, fields and industries are kind of blending. And so we, as organizations, we need to have a little bit of a broader outlook towards what our landscape is, right? So that part of gaining insight, let's say if we're trying to create a new solution for banking or for payment, there might be a lot of interesting insights and dots to connect in things that are beyond what we will consider the finance landscape. There might be something around culture, how young people relate to, the value of money. What does it mean to have money for a young person? Things that maybe are a little bit more on the periphery. And that kind of work is really interesting because you start connecting not just very core user needs of solve a very specific kind of problem. Like, for instance, how do I make this transfer of money faster and more efficient? That's one kind of more core, you could say, situation. But then also what's beyond that, understanding how do people relate to value and money and finance and things like that. Those insights, they can give you a better sense of direction on what kind of ideas you should be targeting, because are you making a solution for the next year, for the next 3 years, or do you want something that will last, that will withstand the pass of time, right? So that part I found it extremely interesting before engaging on the actual ideation part and coming up with solutions, being very clear in what is the problem that we're trying to solve, right?
Yeah. So maybe sort of bringing in some practical examples from my experience on both service design and family offices. So thinking through family offices, some of their challenges today, and where there's sort of, I also sort of simplify them into 4 Ds of service design. There's a lot more to it. It's a lot more complex, naturally, but the discovery, the design, the development, and the delivery. So if we think a little bit about family offices today and how they think about, thinking through some of their portfolio strategy, where are things heading in, the future? How should they be thinking about allocating capital? How should they be thinking about, the next generation and preserving wealth? What types of trends and disruptions are hitting their industry? So that a lot of that sort of sits in the discovery phase, and a lot of naturally the work that Nicholas does, particularly within the sort of insights and futures pieces, is particularly interesting, and we'll sort of unpack a bit of that a bit more. Next, if you look at a little bit more of the design piece, so as we know, wealth owners, incredibly smart and capable humans, they are quite hypothesis-led. So getting to ensuring that they're able to sort of design and co-design effectively with the right type of insight from that discovery phase is crucial. What that means is, based on the problems that they have sitting within their organizations today, whether that's the family office, whether that's the servicing and lifestyle capabilities, whether that's the legacy company which they initially might be sitting on the board of, how can they think about designing solutions and services and ultimately strategies to deal with some of the challenges that they face within that. So that's sort of the design phase. When we then begin to think a little bit more about that development phase, family offices then, as I sort of previously mentioned, this idea of being quite hypothesis-led, great, that's an interesting recommendation. What are some of the things that we can ultimately go out and experiment and test on? So if you're thinking about it as a wealth owner, perhaps you have an investment thesis that you're thinking of rolling out in a nascent industry like biotech, or perhaps it's climate tech, and you're thinking about, okay, you want to see what impact that might have. Can you run a couple of experiments? And can you sort of iterate throughout that process? And how do you sort of design the process within your fund to be able to think about that? From a service provision perspective, naturally, there's other ways in which you can think about prototyping those experiences and sort of testing it before you ultimately create the final phase, which is, a little bit more about delivery. And that is really, how do you take what you've learned from this process and how do you actually begin to sort of refine it? And there, again, family offices can think, okay, we've run this process of understanding the market. We have designed a solution. We've tested it out with our thesis, or a new way of servicing the family or some of the assets we might have. or introducing a new type of software, or running a new sort of cybersecurity program, or migrating our data. What have we learned from this process? And then ultimately, how can we then begin to refine that process and really get it to a point where it's fit for purpose and future-proof? Now, this is an end-to-end process, which, for many family offices, they either might not, have the time and luxury of being able to sort of go end-to-end with that process. But for many of them, there's parts of that process and they're in parts of that journey already. They might just not realize it. So it's almost trying to help them understand, where they might be sitting in that journey today, and which parts of that journey you can sort of support with. And maybe another piece I'd love to pull on, Nicholas, is a little bit more about futures. So some work, we've seen is very much, if you think about the world of funds, they need to begin to think a little bit more about how might different future scenarios begin to impact their investment thesis, their family's legacy, etc.
Yes, I think that this this idea of prospective thinking, being able to think about the future in a systematic, but then also I would say quite at the core of how organizations operate, I think is becoming more and more relevant, especially in the times that we're living in now. There's the kind of famous saying that the next decade will only take 5 years to happen, and I think you really feel that in terms of the impact of the technological, political, and social changes that are happening. That before will take a whole decade to unfold, now are happening in shorter and shorter time spans, right? So how do we put in place ways of working with the future that is, not just an exercise that we do every 2 years or every 3 years, but actually something that we do all the time. I think it's a little bit like going to the gym. Like, you're never really done being healthy or like being fit. You need to constantly do it for the rest of your life. So it's a little bit like that. It's a hygiene exercise that organizations need to do and figure out to what extent that skill needs to be at the core of how they work, right? So I like this concept of multi-speed thinking, understanding that there are some tracks of development and strategy that are slower, slower changes depending on the industry that maybe take decades to unfold, to change, and there are other tracks that are operate in a faster speed, right? So some parts of a family business might need quite updated insight on the future. You could say what are the trends, what are the tendencies, what are the drivers that are affecting our landscape, right? On right here, right now, for the next 1 year, for the next 3 years, right? But there might be also some other industries that maybe change is slower. Change takes more time, and maybe that's not just right here, right now. Maybe that requires deeper insights, and those processes are also kind of slower, right? So I would say that not all companies need to just follow the trends as soon as they come up as soon as they get critical mass. Some companies also need to feel confident on what they do and stay on one track instead of kind of constantly changing. And there are some other industries that also require you to kind of keep a finger in the pulse constantly, right? So it comes in different levels, and I would say that organizations need to learn, where are we? What kind of futures thinking do we need to have? Because it's not the same for different industries, for different fields, for different operations.
Yeah, I'd love to add to that. From my previous life, I ran cultural intelligence for a decade, and I think what you're saying was really resonating, Nicholas, because I always used to think about what are the macro cultural forces at play, and you're right, these are decades long. They shift, and they really are kind of ongoing human truths that sit at the fundamental of each kind of culture. And yes, there are cultural nuances in different geographies, but actually they kind of remain broadly true. Underneath that, you have trends, which are probably a little more temporal. And then underneath that, you have like signals where you're seeing these very quick memes and flashes, and having someone and a partner to really be able to kind of decode those for you and say, look, this is part of the bigger picture that we're seeing. And this is where absolutely you should be thinking about how you're shifting, whether it's in investment strategies or philanthropic focus, whatever it may be. But don't react quick to understand the trends and understand the signals, but know it's information. And I think that's part of our job as strategists as well, who are kind of in this space, to really be there to partner and understand like what is the information that's going to be really relevant to a family office and a business, and what is good to know. But, you know, as Nicholas was saying, really ensure that it's not reacting to everything you see, and have a much more strategic approach in how you leverage those future insights.
Yeah, very, very, very accurate. So, you know, I've seen quite a bit of demand for family offices trying to think through a little bit more of those macro trends, you know, thinking through a little bit, what does that mean for some of our investments? What does that mean for us as a family? You know, how should we be thinking about managing our operations as a family office? How should we then begin thinking a little bit about de-risking for the future, and setting ourselves up for success? Do we need to actually divest from certain industries and invest in others? Do we hold our position? Do we not? And then how does that actually begin to impact some of the legacy and the sort of outward facing world that we live in? And a lot of the time, what, you know, family offices sort of use to support some of that thinking is, you know, help them to think through some of the key scenarios and how those play out for them, and then think through the decision tree of, if you were to action that scenario, you know, these are the different approaches you could take, and obviously from there figuring out, you know, which strategy is fit for purpose. And that circles quite nicely to my next piece, which is more around purpose. So I think understanding, you know, once wealth owners and family offices understand their place a bit more in the world, and need to begin to think about how they respond to that place in the world, how should they be thinking about purpose, India?
Yeah, no, I love it. And I'd even love to bring it back to in terms of how you think about responding to bigger macro forces in the world, because I think all of it's tied into the same elements, actually. And I really, and I know there's lots of discussions around governance at the moment, but I really think having a deep understanding of who you are as a family, what you stand for, the impact you want to have in the world, and how that expresses is important at a family charter level. But perhaps unsurprisingly, given my background, I think the way in which that's articulated in a brand, in a family office brand, is a huge opportunity. And to be really clear, when I talk about brand, I'm talking about it as a values-driven operating system, not a visuals-driven identity. And I really see a strong brand as being the bridge between your wealth and your legacy. Because once you really have that clearly articulated, then that becomes a real center of gravity for how you think about purpose, how you help bring generations to alignment, how you have a competitive advantage in the market, how you think about your reputation, driving strategic clarity internally. For me, that is your starting point. And that is something you can come back to. And much like corporations do that, right? It's something which then impacts, you know, should I be investing in this? Well, no, if we stand for X, well, why would we go down that rabbit hole? It becomes a really core decision-making framework. So for me, to answer the question more broadly, having a really clear brand and a really well-crafted, thoughtful, values-driven approach is absolutely critical. And then that then feeds into your question of how do we think about purpose? Because once you've got a clear sense of that, it really should define how you're thinking about your foundation efforts, your philanthropic focus. And within that, you know, there may be certain areas which certain family members have more passion for, but a strong brand should sit there as a kind of core guiding element and be able to flex in different directions. That is the very definition of when you look at brands you love in the world, like MasterCard, Priceless, you know, it can stand for one thing, but flex into different elements, whether it's sponsorship or banking or whatever it may be. And that's ultimately what we're trying to create. But I think the brand creation process is one that's really critical, because that's where it gets all family members, all key stakeholders together and aligned. And once you have that at the center, then you can kind of determine how you play in different areas of the business and purpose, etc.
Yeah. So I think the interesting piece, and unpack a little bit more about some of my experiences within the family office world, but very much brand is the activation of purpose, right? It's how purpose shows up in the world and how people experience that purpose and legacy. If you think about many family offices, and we've had a webinar series on this before, but thinking through a little bit more about, whether family offices like it or not, they have the people who engage with them have an experience. So whether that's the employees, whether that is co-investors, whether that's the family themselves, and whether that's the public. So there's those sorts of lenses that when family offices begin to think about how they should engage with the public, should we be having a public-facing brand as a family office? Well, that's a question that the family need to sort of tackle through, and it's a meaningful question to sort of ask. And I'll obviously get your point of view on that, India. But I think thinking through, for a lot of families, you already have a public-facing brand. You might just not be conscious of what that brand looks like. And from the moment an email is sent, that email signature through to a contract is signed, through to a PowerPoint presentation that's sent, whatever it might be. Thinking through that sort of term sheet and how that's worded and presented, through to the job offer in the sort of war for talent within family offices, how that sort of brand comes to life and sort of begins to make sure that the purpose the family office is trying to action on is communicated is key. So how are you seeing family offices beginning to take sort of the power of brand to sort of own their own narrative, India?
Yeah, and I love that. I think building what you just said, like if we take the definition of a brand, which is much more holistic, a values-driven operating system, you don't necessarily have to market that, right? It can exist as a real strong strategic asset that then enables you to really kind of, I think, optimize all different areas of your business. So in terms of your question, how people are thinking about brand, it obviously very much depends on the family. I think we've got some probably younger, more entrepreneurial focused entities who maybe have come from commercial backgrounds or entrepreneurial backgrounds and are very used to the benefit of brands, and therefore are treating it in quite a traditional way in terms of they're going through the brand creation process. They want to have an identity, especially if you are thinking about direct investing and much more in the venture space, making it very clear that you stand for something in the market, you have credibility, you have reputation, you have trust is really important. I also think it's really valuable as you're kind of building and creating a new family office and you're trying to attract talent, as you mentioned, having a kind of really clear set of understanding about what it is you stand for, the impact you're trying to have and what you want to do in the world. It is a beacon which attracts different people, different partners, different investment opportunities. So that's really powerful. I think that's probably much more in a kind of more modern creation of family offices. In terms of how I think brand can be leveraged in perhaps more kind of traditional outfits, what we're starting to see is, as you mentioned, like whether you like it or not, people are becoming more public facing perhaps, or they're starting to realize that actually if they don't control the narrative will be written for them elsewhere. So having a really clear sense of your own wealth story and how you want to present yourself to the world, even if you don't talk about it, it at least gives you kind of reputational security. It gives you a kind of, we talk about it as a brand bodyguard, a way in which you can sort of have a clear sense of how you are discussing all the different areas that you kind of outlined, whether it's the time sheet or whether it's kind of more widely focused. I think not having it is riskier. I know that's been said before, but I think we're in a day and age where this is something that is absolutely kind of paramount to how people present themselves in the world, how you can start to really think about all boats rise as soon as you have that center of gravity. And that's very much how I think it's nascent. I think it's people are still kind of starting to understand the potential of it. But I always think about brand as being one of the most underleveraged assets in a company. a strong brand can drive a third of a company's overall value in the corporate world. I think when it comes to family offices, the opportunity is huge in terms of what it can do for not only kind of driving an external presence if you want that, but certainly kind of the professionalization of services and driving a kind of really strong internal culture and driving that talent. A brand in a values-driven sense is one of the best things you can invest in and really kind of focus efforts on.
Yeah, and again, sort of thinking about a brand in terms of, it's the sort of touch point layer that people experience of a service, so that there's so much more sort of happening behind that, and where and how a brand sort of shows up along that journey is obviously key. I'm going to unpack a little bit more about the process, but we have a great question, which I would love to sort of bring up, and then I'll sort of dive a little bit more into the sort of practicalities of if you are a family office today, or you are a service provider, as sort of looking to understand the process of beginning to engage in service design for family offices. What does that look like? So we have a question. What are some of the practical ways to break down silos that exist at a generational level within a family office, such as views on impact investing and digitization? So, I have a view on co-creation, and perhaps I'll just sort of use that word and sort of throw it to the audience. Nicholas, maybe sort of start off with you. How would you think about breaking down these silos to sort of bring people along in the journey?
Yeah, actually, the first thing that came to my mind is a very concrete story that I experienced about a year ago, where I was doing a big workshop for one of the big four companies. I think we were around 100 people in a big conference room discussing, kind of future drivers and impactful trends and things like that, right? One of the things that was a lot discussed was purpose and the new generations and the new generations kind of attitude towards work, right? And their likeness for flexibility and things like that. And I remember there was one person, like a man in his maybe 60s, who was saying, yeah, but we can see that as long as we pay them well, they're going to stay here, right? So that he didn't really buy too much into that, right? And it was funny because there was in one of the tables, there was an intern, it was a girl that was maybe 22 or 23 years old, very young, and she kind of just stood up and said, like, no, you don't get it. Like, I can do, it doesn't matter if I work for Deloitte, for PwC, or it's the same job. Now I'm working remote, so like, what's in it for me? Like, I need something more that kind of fulfills me in that way. And it was very evident in that room. There was just two generations that really looked at work in a very, very different way from very different angles. And she was very brave, and I think she actually represents maybe the courage that maybe younger generations have when it comes to that. So when it comes to the question of practical things, actually for me it's really simple. It's like putting people in the same room and trying to make them talk, create dialogue. Like one of the definitions of dialogue is getting lost together, and I think there's a beauty about that, and how if you put people that are actually from different generations that might have different set of values and motivations for work and their careers in the same room, and try to facilitate spaces where they can talk, where they can work together under the same purpose and things like that. I think that is what eventually breaks those silos. Because more than trying to find the truth, like what's true or what's not, is very interesting to look into the tensions. And just like in that room, there was a tension, and it's not that one was right or wrong. I think those two things can coexist. So when it comes to a generational divide, I think there's a lot of things that will continue to coexist. And I think if we make room for those things to actually exist and listen to each other, I think we might have a better chance of breaking those silos. And it's so simple, but I think it's so hard for organizations to do that, because a lot of them are still kind of, stuck in more hierarchical ways of working, where people that is at the top rarely talk to those who are at the bottom. And I think it goes back to what we were talking at the beginning on the value on this kind of processes, service design thinking, in a way of involving people, making them work together, and sharing perspectives with one another, I think is key to kind of start breaking some of those silos.
Yeah. I'd love to add to that. I couldn't agree more. And I think to add a positive spin on it, I think having led multi-generational research for a decade and interviewed hundreds of thousands of people, I can really safely say I think there's more that unites us generationally than divides us. And one of the things that I love to do first when you get everyone into a room, totally agree with that, is remind us of what does success look like, and really try and create a shared outcome and vision for that outcome from the offset. And actually, in the case of family offices, there's obviously like a deeply ingrained shared goal in how do we protect and preserve the family's wealth and legacy. That's what it's in service of. And like, obviously there are nuances within that, but how do we align on that goal from the offset and get people working on the same page? And then from there, you facilitate conversations and try and have an open-minded perspective. Well, yes, we could do it in this way, but we could also perhaps try this. Or what if we was combine these approaches, and keeping that kind of like top overall outcome you're trying to achieve at the forefront? I think getting people on the same page and then really reminding that we share the common outcome and what we're all in service of the same goal is a really powerful way, again, simple, but really powerful way of breaking down silos and getting people working together and being open to different perspectives. And that goes both ways. Both generations can be open to different perspectives because we all have a lot to learn from each other.
Definitely. I think, even if we look at the likes of, Ray Dalio's Bridgewater, this idea of encouraging a culture of transparency. Now, obviously, there's times where certain experiments do and don't work, and there's needs for sort of more hierarchical dynamics. That being said, I think the beauty of bringing people together to co-create what great looks like is key. The simplest thing is ask people what they want, and they're actually pretty good at telling you sometimes. But you sometimes have to actually ask them. And the other sort of, monocle of wisdom that I've had sort of repeated back to me multiple times is everyone you meet has something to teach you. And particularly when it comes to helping them do their job better, as you try and help them to understand, what are your aligned objectives? Are we still working well as a high-performing sports team to get to the outcome that we're looking to drive? And, where are there frictions that we can improve? Yeah. Conscious of time, because I could speak on this topic for ages, thinking through a little bit more about, how a family office today would think about implementation. As sort of mentioned earlier, when thinking about service design, it doesn't necessarily always mean you need to engage with it from an end-to-end process. The same from thinking through the sort of brand process. Naturally, the value sits in sort of the implementation piece, and that's often where people get the most excited. But a lot of the actual work that is required to get to that point is sort of the insights piece and thinking through really, can we unpack the really sort of juicy, meaty sort of questions behind that. So thinking through as a family office, where and who should be the person to sort of championing this with inside an organization. It'd be interesting to get your thoughts on that, India.
I think it's got to be I think it's most successful when it's come from someone who has the ability to really implement the change. It's got to be someone who's a key decision maker, who can be a CEO, it can be from lower down, but so long as they have the ability and remit to implement this change and the authority to try and really ensure this is embedded, that's what's critical. The reason why I say that isn't because I believe in hierarchies at all, but it's all very well going through this process. It's going to be really interesting and really informative. But where these processes live or dies in the ongoing implementation, not just a few months after, but is this truly going to be embedded throughout? And that person who's responsible for it needs to be able to ensure that everybody within the organization is going to adopt it. Everybody adopts new ways of working, that this change management is really seen through. And I think that's, it's no mean feat. And therefore, I'd love to ensure that we are partnering with people who have that remit and that responsibility, because that's what's going to set it up for success the most. In terms of titles, that can be various different people. I'm very open to collaborating with whoever's open to think in this way and wants to drive change in the organization. And it can come, and I have worked with, multiple different people, but I think the general premise is it has to, in order for ultimately to be successful, we need to look to the end goal as well.
I think there's something to just sort of keep in mind, for many family offices, to be completely candid, they might not have this capability in-house. I'd be quite surprised if they did. And that's the value of really thinking through, sort of outsourcing versus insourcing. It takes them time to develop these new ways of thinking, these new ways of working, to drive innovation, to optimize processes, and to introduce, more innovative solutions. What that means is ultimately they need to think more holistically about how they bring in experts to build the muscle, to build the trust, and to sort of help with implementing that process. So thinking through a little bit more as well about, what type of pitfalls you might see in other types of clients or industries before we sort of wrap up. Perhaps one for you, Nicholas. Are you seeing any, areas where when beginning to engage with service design, other organizations might not be getting the most out of it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, generally speaking, I would say when it's a matter of focus, like when if we focus only on the solution as an isolated thing, I think you're not getting the best out of it. I think you need to think systemically. You need to think about also the unintended consequences of the solutions that we create. So it's not just about using the process to create frictionless, smooth solutions, ideas, experiences, or products. It's also about thinking about what will be the unintended consequences of that into people that maybe are not your users, maybe into the environment, into society, into other kinds of areas, right? So if you're not thinking systemically, I think you're limiting too much. Because you might not see some opportunities or some possible threats that this solution could have.
Well, thank you so much to everyone for joining today. It's been an absolutely delightful conversation. I could speak on this topic for ages and ages. That being said, I think if you're wanting to, follow the wonderful work that India and Nicholas do, please do connect with them on LinkedIn, or obviously on sort of Simple's platform. So thank you for joining the webinar on family office service design. If you'd like to learn more about family office service design, you can log in or sign up to the complimentary account to access Simple's comprehensive family office service design report, which covers a lot more of what has been touched on today. With your account, you can also post free family office jobs, roles, connect with others, download future reports as well. It's really a fantastic place to find guides, tools, data, services across the Simple platform and ecosystem. So stay tuned for our next upcoming webinar, which will be more focused on software and technology, I believe. Look forward to you all joining us there. Thank you for your time.